Melissa Foster stood in front of the mirror, looking at the new tattoo on her shoulder. The twisting vines of bright colors perfectly complemented the pattern that covered almost the entire left side of her body. 28 years old, and her skin had become a canvas, chronicling her life, her decisions, the twists and turns of fate. "Been to that new salon again?" Daniel's voice, her husband's, came from the hallway. She flinched and quickly pulled her shirt on, her thin artist's fingers running over the buttons. Yes, Jane had done an amazing job. Would you like to see it? Daniel appeared in the doorway, tall, trim, in a pressed shirt and a clipboard in his hand. 32 years old and looking like a corporate brochure, perfectly coiffed dark hair, narrow glasses, a reserved expression. "Sorry, I have a meeting in 10 minutes. You'll show me tonight." He absent-mindedly ran his eyes over the screen. "Don't expect me for dinner, there's a video conference." "Sure," Melissa smiled, but the smile didn't touch her eyes. It was the same as always. The front door closed, and Melissa exhaled. When had they managed to become such strangers? 4 years of marriage, and it was like different planets. She ran her hand over the new tattoo, another chapter in her personal history that Daniel wasn't interested in. Lately, the only things her husband noticed were unpaid bills or an unlocked refrigerator door. After breakfast, Melissa picked up her sketchbook and left the house. The morning Wisconsin greeted her with a spring chill. She didn't want to go back to her studio. It was too lonely. Her feet carried her to a familiar neighborhood where the Blue Guitar Bar was located in an old brick building. The bar was almost empty during the day, the sunlight streaming through the tall windows, illuminating the wooden tables and vintage posters on the walls. "There's our artist!" Carol smiled radiantly as she wiped down the bar. "A regular cinnamon latte?" "You're a miracle." Melissa lowered herself onto a high stool and ran her hand over her shaved temple, leaving long strands on the other side. "Is Ryan here?" "Upstairs, dealing with the vendors." Carol rolled her eyes, starting up the coffee machine. "They brought in the wrong beer again. I swear sometimes I think this bar would have closed down without me." She moved behind the counter with the polished grace of someone who knew what she was doing. 29 years old, confidence in every movement, short red hair and a scattering of freckles on her face. "How long have you two been working together?" Melissa asked, opening her sketchbook to a blank page and beginning to sketch the interior of the bar with quick strokes. "Since I was a student," Carol said, whipping the milk with concentration. "Ryan and I met freshman year. He wanted to be a rock star," she laughed softly. "And then it turned out he had a talent for business. Who knew?" "Carol, please tell me you made coffee." Ryan came down the spiral staircase, tucking his phone into the back pocket of his jeans as he went. "Oh, Melissa, hi. Long time no see." Their gazes met for a moment longer than necessary. Ryan Grant, 30 years old, sloppy stubble, disheveled dark blonde hair, leather bracelet on his left wrist. "I had a trade show, then orders." Melissa averted her eyes and took a sip of coffee. "But now I had time for myself." Ryan leaned against the counter, looking at her sketch. "Wow, you're immortalizing us?" He smiled, pointing at the drawing. "How's that corporate collar of yours doing? Still saving the world with numbers and spreadsheets?" "He's an engineer, not an accountant," Melissa smiled. "And yes, he's still missing work. Sometimes I think he's married to his laptop instead of me. I can't understand how a man can voluntarily spend 12 hours in an office." Ryan shook his head. "Not everyone considers a bar with live music to be the pinnacle of their career," Carol jokingly parried, handing him a cup of coffee. "That's because they don't have a fantastic assistant like you." Ryan put one arm around her, and Melissa noticed a particular ease to their interaction. People who knew each other by heart. "Hey, did you tell Melissa about the jazz quartet?" Carol gave him a quick glance. "I was just about to." "What quartet?" Melissa looked up from the album. "Next Wednesday. Amazing guys from Chicago," Ryan explained. "I got them a gig in exchange for a case of that rare bourbon. Real jazz, Mel. Daniel's not a big fan of that kind of music, is he?" "Right." Melissa traced her finger around the rim of the cup thoughtfully. "Maybe I'll stop by on my own." Carol watched as they exchanged glances. Melissa had become a frequent visitor to the bar over the months. and with each visit the tension between her and Ryan grew more palpable. It worried Carol. She knew her friend all too well, and remembered how his previous attempt at a relationship with an unfree woman had ended. After Melissa left, Carol waited until the few customers had left the bar and turned to Ryan. "Do you see where this is going?" "What do you mean?" Ryan pretended to focus on the inventory. "Come on!" Carol crossed her arms over her chest. "I see the way you look at her. I see the way she looks at you. We're just friends." "Of course," Carol snorted. "And I'm the Queen of England. Look, I saw what happened to you after the Sarah thing. I don't want that to happen again." Ryan tensed. "This is different. Melissa and her husband haven't been right for a long time. He doesn't appreciate her." "But you do, don't you?" Carol shook her head. "Just remember, she's married, to your ex-boyfriend." "I know. It's good that at least one of you remembers that," Carol sighed. The Adrenaline Tattoo Parlor was a bright spot among the stores on the quiet street. Melissa had come here for the third week in a row to work on a large tattoo on her back. "What's up, my favorite canvas?" Jane Moore greeted her with her usual energy. 26 years old, hair dyed purple, nose ring, every inch of her arms covered in tattoos. "Ready to continue our Phoenix?" "More than ready." Melissa took off her jacket. "Yesterday I looked in the mirror and couldn't wait to see it finished." The tattooing process always calmed her. The monotonous whirring of the machine, the focus of the artist, the feeling that you were creating a new version of yourself. Jane worked quickly, periodically wiping away blood and ink. "How are your watercolor experiments going?" she asked, adding an orange hue to the Phoenix's fiery feathers. "Still working." Melissa grimaced at the sharp stab of pain. "I'm trying to combine them with digital graphics for my next exhibit." "You're having a solo?" "At the Madison Street Gallery in 3 months," Melissa smiled. "The curator saw my work in a group show and offered me a whole room." "Awesome!" Jane paused, changing the needle. "By the way, there's a rumor going around about a guy who did tattoos a couple blocks from here. Allegedly, a few of his clients caught hepatitis." "Really?" Melissa frowned, suddenly uncomfortable. "The asshole was saving money on disposable needles." Jane shook her head. "A disgrace to the profession. I'm sterile, don't worry. I even checked the ink several times." Melissa nodded, but the thought lingered uncomfortably. She trusted Jane, but she'd heard too many stories of unprofessionals in the tattoo industry. Wednesday night, the Blue Guitar was packed. The news of the jazz quartet had spread quickly. Melissa showed up in a simple black dress, hair gathered so that the new tattoo on her neck, part of a phoenix rising up her back, was visible. "You came." Ryan found her at the bar and held out a glass of wine. "I was afraid you'd change your mind." "The music is amazing." Melissa took a sip, nodding toward the stage where a saxophonist was strumming a tune, closing her eyes in pleasure. "How did you find them?" "Carol's credit," he nodded toward the bar, where a red-headed girl was deftly mixing cocktails. "She has an incredible eye for talent. She just heard them once at some club in Chicago and dragged them to me. They took a table in the corner, not too far from the stage but in the shade, a place where they could enjoy the music and still talk. How's your work going?" Melissa asked, twirling her glass in her fingers. "Remember that vendor who kept messing up orders?" Ryan smiled. Carol had finally taken matters into her own hands, ran into their warehouse and made such a scene that now they call 3 times to make sure they got it right. "She's amazing," Melissa said. "Are you and her—" "What?" Ryan laughed. "No, we're just friends. We've always been just friends." "I'm sorry. It's just that you two have such a rapport." "Is she married?" "Yeah, to Ted." Ryan grinned. "He's a total bastard, if you ask me. Controlling her every move, jealous of everything. I don't know what she sees in him." Melissa thought, sometimes we fall in love with people and then we realize they're not what they seem. "How's Daniel?" Ryan asked quietly. She looked into his eyes. "We were students. I was impressed with his confidence, his ambition. I thought we'd build a future together. And then his future didn't turn out to have much to do with you," Ryan finished. "Something like that." Melissa took another sip. "He's not a bad person, it's just that we want different things." They listened to the music, occasionally exchanging comments. Just 2 people enjoying jazz. When their fingers accidentally touched on the table, neither pulled away. After the show, the bar began to empty. Carol was busy counting the register, and Melissa looked at her watch. I have to go. Is Daniel waiting? Not really, she grinned. He's in Chicago for a conference until Friday. There was silence for a moment. The air between them felt electrified. I could show you my vintage record collection. Ryan's voice got a little lower. Upstairs, in the apartment. Their gazes met. Something unspoken hung in the air between them. That would be interesting, Melissa replied quietly. Ryan's apartment above the bar was unexpectedly cozy. Wood-paneled walls, bookshelves, an old leather sofa, and a really impressive collection of vinyl records. Wow! Melissa walked along the shelves. Do you have the original Kind of Blue by Miles Davis? Not only that, Ryan pulled the record out of the envelope with the reverent tenderness of a collector. Shall we listen? As the first notes of So What played, Melissa closed her eyes. Ryan stood beside her, watching her, the way the music reflected on her face, the way the shadows from the floor lamp danced across her neck, emphasizing the lines of her tattoo. This was probably a bad idea, he said suddenly. Why? Melissa opened her eyes. Because I want to kiss you too badly, he said simply. And you're married to a friend of mine. Melissa took a step toward him. To a friend you haven't seen in almost a year? To a man who can't remember the last time he looked at me the way you're looking at me right now? Ryan touched her cheek gently. It's still wrong. It's still wrong. She agreed and moved forward, touching her lips to his. Miles Davis continued to play as their bodies intertwined on the sofa, the impatient hands, the confused breathing, the desire that had been building for weeks. Ryan kissed the patterns on her skin, following the lines of the tattoos as if reading a map. Melissa entwined her fingers in his hair, feeling truly desirable for the first time in a long time. So that's what you're doing while I'm downstairs shoveling papers. They pulled away from each other. Carol was standing in the doorway, holding a stack of papers. Her face was a mixture of surprise and disappointment. Carol, Ryan jumped up, adjusting his shirt. Come on. Carol put the papers down on the table. It's sensational that you two have finally gotten past your meaningful looks and gotten down to business. I think I'll be going now. Melissa stood up hurriedly, avoiding looking at the two of them. Wait, Carol sighed. At least check your clothes, or they'll think the street thinks the blue guitar is offering special favors now. Melissa nodded appreciatively, tidying herself up. When she came out, a heavy silence hung between Carol and Ryan. Don't look at me like that. Ryan ran his hand through his hair. How? Like someone who knows you're making a huge mistake? Carol crossed her arms across her chest. She's married. To your friend. Daniel is not my friend, Ryan replied sharply. We haven't spoken normally in a year. Not since he didn't show up to my father's funeral because he had some damn presentation. It doesn't matter. That's his wife. Carol stepped closer. Remember Sarah? Ryan tensed at the mention of that name. It's different. Isn't it? A woman in a marriage, dissatisfied with the relationship, looking for adventure on the side? Melissa's not like that. Do you know her? Carol softened. I'm sorry. I just don't want you to get hurt again. I mean, you're just starting to come around. Ryan came over and hugged his friend. I'm a big boy. I can handle it. Of course you can. Carol patted him on the back. You've got me to pick you up when things go down. She left, and Ryan was left alone in a room that still smelled of Melissa's perfume and played jazz. He knew he'd crossed the line. But for the first time in a long time, he felt alive, and it was stronger than any argument of reason. The leaves outside the window had already turned their first green when Melissa and Ryan's relationship went from a casual connection to something more. They met almost every day, sometimes in his apartment above the bar, sometimes in her studio when Daniel was late for work. Melissa found herself looking forward to these meetings with an eagerness she hadn't experienced in years. You're early today. Carol didn't even look up from her ledger when Melissa walked into the bar on a sunny Thursday morning. I have a window between orders. Melissa set the sketchbook folder on the counter. Ryan's not down yet? Sleeping like a log? Carol finally looked up at her. He was up until 3 o'clock last night dealing with vendors. I'm the only one who knows what it takes to keep this bar afloat. Melissa noticed the circles under the redhead's eyes. You look tired. Ted made a scene last night when I got home late. Carol shrugged. It was just business as usual. Do you want coffee? Thank you. Melissa watched Carol's deft handling of the coffee machine. Can I ask you something? You and Ryan have never had, you know. Carol laughed, but not in a funny way. Everyone always asks that question. No, we're just friends. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to. It's okay. Carol set a cup of latte down in front of her. Ryan and I have known each other forever. I've seen his ups and downs, and he's seen mine. There was just never a spark, you know? And then I met Ted and... She stopped talking. What is she doing? Who hooks up speakers like that? In the far corner of the bar, a new waitress was trying to set up the music equipment. Carol went to help with a sigh, and Melissa opened her sketch folder. She was working on a series of drawings for a new exhibition, abstract shapes inspired by tattoos. Melissa was so immersed in her work that she didn't notice someone coming up behind her. It looks amazing, Ryan's voice came to her ear, his hands on her shoulders. You scared me, Melissa smiled without turning around. Good morning. Good afternoon now. Ryan kissed the top of her head. Carol said, How long have you been here? About an hour. Melissa finally turned to him. I didn't want to wake you up. Ryan looked a little rumpled, his hair still damp from his shower, a pillow mark on his cheek. He leaned over and kissed her, quickly but gently. Melissa involuntarily looked around. There was no one in the bar except Carol, who pretended to be completely absorbed in adjusting the speakers. Don't worry, she already knows everything. Ryan took a cup and poured coffee. Carol's got my back if Daniel shows up. Daniel never comes in here. Actually, he did. Carol returned to the counter. Last week, he was looking for you, but I told him I hadn't seen you in a while. Melissa tensed. He didn't suspect anything? It didn't seem like it. Carol shrugged. He said you weren't answering your cell phone. I left my phone at the studio. Melissa looked away. He could have driven over and checked it himself. Oh yeah, I imagine Daniel Foster, engineering genius, getting his ass off his desk chair before the workday was over, Ryan snorted. That would be a miracle. Melissa sighed. That's actually what I liked about him at first. His dedication, his ambition. And now? Ryan asked quietly. Now I feel like a piece of furniture. A piece of furniture that's only noticed when it's out of place. Melissa started to gather her drawings. I gotta go. I have a meeting with the gallery owner at 2. I'll see you tonight? Ryan touched her arm. Daniel will be back late. But it's best not to take any chances. She shook her head. I need to finish my work for the exhibit anyway. Tomorrow then. Ryan squeezed her fingers. I miss you when you're not around. They weren't just words. There was a sincerity in them that Melissa hadn't heard from her husband in a long time. She nodded and on impulse kissed him again, longer, deeper. God, get a room, Carol moaned, but there was a smile in her voice. When Melissa left, Ryan turned to his friend. Did you really say you didn't see her? Of course, Carol sighed. I'm not going to turn you in. But Ryan, this can't go on forever. Sooner or later, Daniel's going to find out. And then what? Are you prepared for the possibility that she might choose him? Carol gave her friend a hard look. Ryan, I know you like the back of my hand. You're already head over heels in love. And for her, it could just be It's not a fling, Carol, Ryan interrupted sharply. You don't see us together. There's something real between us. Okay. Carol held up her hands in a conciliatory gesture. Just be careful. I don't want to put you back together again in pieces. Ryan nodded, but deep down he knew that caution was the last thing he could promise when it came to Melissa. That afternoon, Melissa sat in the doctor's office looking at the information booklet on the wall. The usual annual checkup, nothing out of the ordinary. She filled out a questionnaire, answered questions about her health, and had blood drawn for tests. Have you had any tattoos recently? Dr. Bentley, a middle-aged woman with kind eyes and graying hair, asked. Yes, I have a lot of them, Melissa nodded. I started getting the last one a couple months ago. Why? Just checking, the doctor made a note. What salon? Adrenaline, it's a new place. Melissa frowned. Is something wrong? There have been a few cases of hepatitis linked to unprofessional tattoo parlors recently. The doctor closed the chart. But I'm sure there's nothing wrong with your case. Do they use disposable needles? Of course, Melissa nodded. Jane is very careful about sterility. Then there's nothing to worry about, the doctor smiled. We'll call you back with the results of the tests within a week. Walking out of the clinic, Melissa felt strangely uneasy. She trusted Jane completely, but last time she really noticed some stains on the master's gloves. No, this was just paranoia. The phone call came 5 days later when Melissa was finishing up a new painting in her studio. Mrs. Foster, this is Dr. Bentley's office. The doctor would like you to come in to discuss your test results. Is something wrong? Melissa's heart skipped a beat. The doctor would prefer to discuss it in person. Can you come back tomorrow morning at 10 a.m.? Melissa spent the night anxious. Daniel noticed her restlessness, but wrote it off as pre-show stress. He even offered to drive her to the clinic, but she declined, just in case. Dr. Bentley's words sounded like a judgment. You have the human immunodeficiency virus, Melissa. I'm so sorry. The world seemed to stop. Melissa heard the doctor's voice as if through a layer of water, something about confirmatory tests, about modern treatments, about how it wasn't a death sentence. But all she could think about was how. Where from? Could it have been a tattoo parlor? She finally asked, interrupting the doctor's monologue. Probably. Especially if you say you had no other risks of infection. You need to tell your spouse, Melissa. He needs to be tested too. Daniel. Ryan. Oh my God, Ryan. After leaving the clinic, Melissa sat in her car for a long time, unable to start the engine. Everything inside was numb. She remembered Jane's words about the hepatitis cases. Could she have used non-sterile equipment? No. Jane seemed so professional. But there was simply no other explanation. Her first impulse was to call Ryan, but what would she tell him? That she might have given him a deadly disease? That he now had to get tested too? How many times had they been close over the months? Dozens? Melissa finally started the car and drove to the only place she could find solace now, the Blue Guitar. The bar was nearly empty at this time of day. Hey, you look awful. Carol frowned when she saw her face. What's wrong? Is Ryan here? Melissa's voice was shaking. Upstairs. Carol came out from behind the counter. Melissa, are you okay? No, she whispered and headed for the stairs. Ryan was sitting at his desk, sorting out bills when she walked in without knocking. One look at her face was enough to know something was wrong. Mel? What? There's something I need to tell you. She sank down onto the couch, feeling her legs wobble. It's important. And scary. Ryan sat down next to her, taking her hands in his. Whatever it is, we can handle it. I'm not sure. Melissa took a deep breath. I've been to the doctor. I had the usual tests. I was diagnosed with HIV. The word hung in the air, heavy and ominous. Melissa watched Ryan's pupils dilate as he tried to make sense of what he was hearing. How is that possible? He finally asked. You're probably through the tattoo, that new one, the Phoenix. I think Jane used non-sterile equipment. Ryan shook his head slowly. Are you sure? There are no other options. Melissa suddenly felt a burning sensation in her eyes. Ryan, you need to take a test. We've been together so many times. To her surprise, Ryan hugged her tightly. Everything's gonna be okay. You hear me? We're gonna get through this together. Together? Melissa pulled away so she could see his face. Don't you understand? I could have infected you. So what? Ryan took her face in the palms of his hands. I love you, Melissa. No matter what happens, I'm with you. She hadn't expected those words. They'd only been dating for a couple months, and while the feelings were strong, neither of them had yet spoken of love. You don't have to. I have to be honest with you. Ryan smiled despite the fear in his eyes. And with himself. I fell in love with you, I think, from the first day you walked into the bar, and no diagnosis is going to change that. Melissa burst into tears, for the first time since hearing the news. Ryan just held her, stroking her back, whispering that everything would be okay, that they'd get through it all. After a few minutes, the door opened quietly, and Carol peeked inside. I'm sorry, I was just worried. She saw Melissa's crying face and Ryan's worried look. What's going on? Close the bar, Carrie, Ryan said quietly, and come upstairs with us. We need to talk. Carol didn't ask a single question. She just nodded, went downstairs, and returned 20 minutes later with 3 cups of hot tea. After listening to Melissa's story, she was silent for a long time, and then she said, "So this salon, adrenaline, infected you?" "Most likely," Melissa nodded. "I have no idea where else. Daniel and I haven't had intimacy in a long time, and with Ryan What about Daniel?" Carol asked. "Are you going to tell him?" Melissa shook her head. "I don't know. We've barely slept together for almost a year now. The last time was 4 months ago. Maybe I was already infected then." "You have to tell him," Carol said firmly. "It's his right to know." "And tell him what? That I contracted HIV by cheating on him with his ex-friend?" Melissa grinned bitterly. "You don't know exactly when you were infected," Ryan pointed out. "Probably before we met." "When did you start getting that tattoo?" Carol asked. "About 3 months ago," Melissa sighed. "God, what have I done?" Carol moved next to her on the couch. "Look, the most important thing right now is to get the right treatment. With modern therapy, people with HIV live long and full lives." "You know so much about it," Melissa was surprised. "My cousin—" Carol stopped talking. "She has HIV too. She's had it for 7 years now. She's married with a healthy child. It's not the end of the world, Melissa." Ryan squeezed Melissa's hand. "We'll be with you, no matter what happens." 2 weeks later, Melissa was sitting in the same room holding Ryan's hand when Dr. Bentley announced the results of his test. Positive. HIV diagnosis confirmed. They didn't speak all the way to the bar. Ryan gripped the steering wheel so hard his knuckles turned white. When they got to the apartment, he walked silently to the bar and poured himself a whiskey. "Ryan," Melissa walked over to him. "I'm sorry, It's not your fault." He set the glass down abruptly. "It's that damn tattoo artist. We should sue her. First, we have to prove she's the source of the infection." "Who else?" Ryan raised his voice. "We know you haven't had it before. We know that several of her clients have gotten hepatitis. What else do you need?" He grabbed the bottle, about to pour another, but Melissa took it away. "It's not gonna help, Ryan." "What will?" He laughed bitterly. "Pills for the rest of your life? Fear of infecting someone? An eternal stigma?" "We'll get through this together," Melissa repeated his own words. "Remember?" Ryan covered his face with his hands. "I don't know, Mel. I just don't know." In the days that followed, Ryan changed. He started drinking more than usual, canceled several bar appearances, spent hours on the internet reading about HIV and its treatment. Carol effectively took over the bar, covering for her friend in front of vendors and customers. Melissa, too, felt her life falling apart. She began taking antiretroviral drugs that produced side effects: nausea, dizziness, fatigue. She stopped working on paintings for the show, lying in bed all day when Daniel was at work. Daniel. She still didn't dare tell him. Every night she gathered her courage, but the words stuck in her throat. How to explain all this to a man who didn't even seem to notice her condition? One night, when Melissa decided she couldn't stay home any longer, she arrived at the Blue Guitar. There was a concert going on at the bar, a country band playing. Usually on days like this, Ryan was the center of attention, chatting with the musicians, mixing cocktails, joking with the customers. But today he was nowhere to be seen. "Where's Ryan?" she asked Carol, blaring over the music. "Upstairs." Carol looked worried. "Something strange is going on with him, Melissa. He barely leaves the apartment. He's drinking. Broke a glass display case today when I tried to talk to him. I'll go up to his place." "Be careful." Carol squeezed her hand. "I've never seen him like this." Ryan's apartment was a mess. Empty bottles, dirty dishes, clothes strewn across the floor. The owner himself was sitting on the floor, leaning against the couch with a bottle of whiskey in his hand. "Ryan," Melissa cautiously lowered herself next to him. "What are you doing?" "Celebrating the destruction of my life." He raised the bottle in a toast. "Will you join me?" "No." She took the bottle from him. "And you've had enough." "Don't tell me what to do." Ryan tried to stand up, but he swayed. This is all because of you." The words hit him harder than a slap. Melissa recoiled. "I know, I'm sorry." No." Ryan immediately regretted it. "That's not what I meant. Hell, I don't know what I'm saying. I'm so angry, Mel. At everything and everyone. At that tattoo artist, at the doctors, at the universe." "Me too," Melissa took his hand. "But we can't go on like this. We need to heal, follow the regimen, support each other." "I don't know if I can." Ryan met her gaze. "I always thought I was strong, but this is too much." "You're not alone." Melissa hugged him. "You have me and Carol." Carol appeared in the doorway, wiping her hands with a towel. "The show's over. I've closed the bar. Do you two need help?" "I think we all need sleep." Melissa helped Ryan up. "I'll stay with him tonight." "Daniel won't come looking for you?" Carol asked. "He's at a conference in Chicago." Melissa shook her head. "I'll see you tomorrow night." Daniel Foster tiredly dropped his suitcase in the hallway and looked around. The house was empty and unusually quiet. He'd returned a full day earlier than he'd planned, determined to surprise his wife. He'd felt a chasm between them over the past few months and wanted to mend their relationship in some way. "Maybe I'll cook dinner like I used to," he thought, unbuttoning his austere jacket. "I'll open that red wine I brought back from France. Let's talk at last." It was odd that Melissa wasn't home. Usually at this time, she was working at the studio or relaxing after her tattoo sessions. Daniel called her, but her phone was off. Shrugging, he decided to clean up before tackling the cooking. The bathroom was a mess. Scattered makeup, towels, tubes of paint. Typical Melissa, creative chaos in everything. Sweeping it all into the hamper, he came across a quadruple-folded piece of paper, a prescription from Dr. Bentley. Is Melissa sick? A disturbing thought flashed through his mind. The name of the drug didn't tell him anything, but the Clinic Center for Immunology and Infectious Diseases made him tense. He pulled out his phone, typed the name of the drug into the search, and froze, staring at the screen. Used to treat HIV infection. His first impulse was to throw the phone away, as if it burned his hand. There must be a mistake. There had to be a mistake. Maybe the prescription's not hers. But the name on the form Melissa Foster left no doubt. Daniel sank to the edge of the tub, trying to get his brain to work rationally. His wife, Melissa the artist, with her endless tattoos and free-spiritedness, was she HIV positive? Fear burned his insides. Is he? Is he infected? We haven't slept together. For how long? 4 months? 5? He counted feverishly. It wasn't that he didn't want to. It was just that work, fatigue, her perpetual excuses. Excuses. Suddenly, all the oddities of Melissa's behavior over the past few months came together into a clear pattern. Her unexplained absences, her unwillingness to be intimate, the phone, which she now kept with her at all times and locked with a passcode. Daniel was no fool, and he certainly wasn't naive. He was an engineer, an analyst, a man of logic and facts. And the facts were screaming. His wife was cheating on him. And not just cheating, she'd put him at risk of contracting a deadly disease. But with whom? And for how long? He walked to the living room where Melissa usually worked. Her laptop lay on the table, a silver MacBook covered in art stickers. Daniel hadn't planned on spying on his wife until today. But right now, it was about his life. Literally. The password to the laptop hadn't changed. 2309, their wedding day. Daniel chuckled bitterly. What irony to keep evidence of infidelity under the password that immortalized their union. He opened the mail, feeling vile, dirty, but unable to stop. In the medical folder, he found correspondence with Dr. Bentley, test results, referrals. The diagnosis had been made 3 weeks ago. 3 weeks, and she hadn't said a word. In the drafts lay several unfinished letters to him. Daniel, there's something I need to tell you. Honey, we need to have a serious talk. Coward, he thought bitterly. Couldn't even write. But the worst was waiting for him in the cloud vault where Melissa kept her photos. Among the snapshots of nature, sketches of new paintings, and photos of tattoos, he found a few shots of Ryan Grant, his former friend, the owner of the blue guitar. Ryan, his college buddy, the man who was best man at their wedding. In the photo, they were together in his apartment above the bar, laughing, holding hands. Melissa with a glass of wine, hair loose, happy, the way he hadn't seen her in a long time. In one photo, Ryan was kissing her neck, with a tenderness impossible to portray. Daniel slammed his laptop shut and leaned back in his chair, feeling nausea coming up to his throat. A wife and a friend, a classic betrayal, a platitude worthy of a cheap melodrama. But that didn't make it any less painful. How long? Pounded in my temples. How long had she been with him? Where else have they been together? In our bed? He stood up and began to pace the room like a caged animal. The pictures in his head were becoming more and more agonizing. Melissa and Ryan laughing at him, discussing what a naive, work-absorbed moron he is, having fun while he provides her with a comfortable life. And now this disease. Maybe she slept with someone else? Or did Grant infect her? It doesn't matter. She's put him, Daniel, at risk. Her husband. The man she'd sworn allegiance to. I should get tested, he thought, feeling a new wave of panic. What if he was infected too? His whole life, his career, his plans all ruined because of her selfishness, because of her betrayal. Daniel sat down at the table and covered his face with his hands. Pain and humiliation were replaced by rage, so intense that for the first time in his life he felt like he might lose control. No one would dare do this to him. No one would humiliate him with impunity. He straightened up and took a deep breath. Daniel Foster had always prided himself on his coolness and rational thinking. It had helped him in his work, in solving complex engineering problems, and now those qualities were going to help him. With what? Revenge. The word formed in his mind clear and cold. Revenge. Not just a divorce, not just a trivial scandal. Real retribution for betrayal and humiliation. Daniel stood up and walked over to the bookcase where he kept his day planner. He began to write. Dates, routes, times. Like an engineer, he calculated every detail, every variable. No impulsive decisions. No trails. Revenge is a dish served cold, he thought, as he wrote down the last details of his plan. God, what a cliché, the thought slipped in and out. Daniel suddenly felt the truth of that phrase in his skin, and for the first time that nightmarish evening he smiled. The phone call woke Lillian Meffridge at 4 a.m. 20 years on the Wisconsin police force had accustomed her to the fact that good news rarely came before dawn. Meffridge, she answered before she was even fully awake. Detective, it's Ramirez. We have a homicide at 27 Maple Street. Art studio. Victim is female, 28 years old. 20 minutes later, Lillian parked the car outside a small 2-story building converted from an old warehouse. Police tape, flashing lights, forensic photographers, all the usual. But something about the atmosphere felt special. The officers were talking in low voices, exchanging glances. Lillian knew the sign. There was something really creepy inside. Ma'am? The young patrolman lifted the tape, letting her through. Inside the studio was an artistic mess. Unfinished paintings, cans of paint, brushes and glasses. And in the middle of this color-saturated space was the body of a young woman in a pool of blood. Dark hair with a shaved temple, tattoos covering her arms and neck, and multiple stab wounds on her chest and stomach. Melissa Foster, 28, artist. Ramirez handed her a file. Studio owner. Body was discovered by the cleaning lady around 3 a.m. A cleaning lady at 3 a.m? Lillian raised an eyebrow. Comes in at night when no one's bothering her. Said the artist often worked late, but usually left by midnight. Tonight the door was unlocked and the lights were on. Lillian put on her gloves and crouched next to the body. The medical examiner was already finishing his preliminary examination. What do you think, Tommy? Multiple stab wounds, at least 20. Judging by the nature of the wounds, they were inflicted with a thin-bladed knife, probably artistic. There's plenty of those around here. He nodded at the table of tools. Death occurred about 6 to 8 hours ago, between 9 o'clock and 11 p.m. Signs of a struggle? There are cuts on her arms, defensive wounds. She tried to close herself off. Blood spatter indicates she was standing here. He pointed to the center of the room when she took the first blow, then fell and tried to crawl away, leaving footprints on the floor. Lillian slowly looked around the room. Something caught her eye, an open journal on a table by the window. She stepped closer. Is it important? She asked the forensic scientist who was photographing the pages. It might be. The last entry is dated yesterday afternoon. It looks like a personal diary. Lillian took a quick look at the page and her eyebrows rose. Told Ryan about the diagnosis. He's shocked, but he promises support. I don't know how long it'll last. I think he blames me, even though he won't tell me. I blame myself. What have I done? And how do I tell Daniel? Who are Ryan and Daniel? She asked. Daniel Foster is the victim's husband, Ramirez answered, checking the records. 32 years old, engineer at Techno Systems. Ryan Grant owns the Blue Guitar Bar 3 blocks from here. He's a close family friend, according to preliminary information. Does the husband know yet? Officers went to his house. They haven't been back yet. What kind of diagnosis are we talking about? Lillian turned the page. My HIV test came back positive. I can't believe it. Jane and her damn salon. How am I going to tell Ryan about this? We've been close so many times. Lillian felt the story getting more complicated by the second. I need to know everything about this woman, her husband, friends, lovers, and find me this Ryan Grant immediately. It's been a long morning. The forensics team was scouring the studio for clues. Lillian was looking at crime scene photos, taking notes. It was already clear that the murder had been committed in a highly emotional state. Too many wounds, too violent. This was not cold revenge, but an explosion of anger. The door swung open and Ramirez walked in. We found Grant. He's in his bar, completely passed out, and covered in blood. The Blue Guitar Bar was closed when Lillian pulled up. An officer was guarding the entrance while forensics worked inside. She walked inside and saw Ryan Grant, disheveled, with dried blood on his shirt and hands. He was sitting at the bar, clutching a cup of coffee while a medic treated the cuts on his palms and forearms. Mr. Grant? Detective Lillian Meffridge. She showed her badge. I need to ask you a few questions. He looked up. Red eyes, puffy face. Melissa really... His voice trailed off. They said she was murdered. I'm afraid so. Lillian sat down across from him. When was the last time you saw her? Yesterday afternoon. She came in here. Ryan rubbed his temples. She left around 4 o'clock. Said she had to work on some paintings for a show. And then? He blinked. Then I drank. A lot. Why? Ryan stared into his cup for a long moment before answering. Personal problems. These problems have to do with Melissa Foster? He looked up. You read her diary? Yes. Were you in a relationship? Yes. He exhaled, as if releasing a weight. A few months. She was married. I know. And she recently told you about her HIV status? Ryan clenched his fists, and one of the cuts started bleeding again. Yes. 3 weeks ago. She got the test results, and 2 weeks later my test came back positive as well. Lillian watched his reaction carefully. That must have made you angry. Of course it did. Ryan raised his voice. But not at her. She's a victim too. That tattoo artist, Jane, used unsterile equipment. Melissa got infected while getting a tattoo. And you believe that story? Why wouldn't I? Melissa wasn't the kind of person who... He stopped talking. We loved each other. So much so that you forgave her for giving you a deadly disease? Ryan looked her straight in the eye. HIV hasn't been a death sentence for a long time, Detective. With the right treatment, people live long and fulfilling lives. And yes, I forgave her. Because there was nothing to forgive. It wasn't her fault. Where were you last night between 9 o'clock and 11 o'clock? Here, drinking. He waved his hand at the broken glass display case. A bit out of sorts, as you can see. Alone? Ryan shook his head. No, with Carol. She works here as a waitress and she's my best friend. We got drunk together after closing time. I'd like to talk to Miss Carol. She went home early this morning. Ryan's face darkened. She had a terrible scandal with her husband, Ted. That jerk is pathologically jealous. She lied to him about staying for inventory, but when she came home this morning in such a state... He rubbed his forehead. He smashed her cell phone. I tried calling. And now you don't know where she is? At home, I suppose. Or at her sister's if things are bad enough. Lillian made a note. I need her address. I'm also wondering, Mr. Grant, did Melissa's husband know about your relationship? And her diagnosis? I don't think so. She didn't have time to tell him. She was going to, but, He swallowed. She didn't have time. How convenient, Lillian squinted. Mr. Grant, I have to inform you that you're the prime suspect in the murder of Melissa Foster. You have a motive, your alibi has yet to be confirmed, and you are literally covered in blood." "That's my blood!" Ryan raised his cut hands. "From broken glasses. Carol will confirm that I was here all night. Forensics will determine that." Lillian stood up. "Don't leave town just yet. We'll talk again." She left the bar and took a deep breath of fresh air. Grant looked genuinely devastated by Melissa's death, but Lillian knew that the worst crimes are often committed by those who love the most, especially when betrayal and illness are involved. Her next stop was the Foster house, a neat two-story cottage in an upscale neighborhood. An officer met her at the front door. "Mr. Foster is inside, Detective. Seems to be in shock." Daniel Foster sat in the living room, staring fixedly at one point. Unlike Ryan, he looked immaculate. Fresh shirt, perfectly styled hair, only his reddened eyes betrayed his condition. "Mr. Foster," Lillian introduced herself. "I'm very sorry for your loss." "Thank you, Detective." His voice sounded smooth, almost mechanical. "I still can't believe it. Who would do this to Melissa?" "We're hoping to find out." "When was the last time you saw your wife?" "Yesterday morning before work. She said she'd be at the studio. She has a show coming up." "And you didn't speak to her during the day?" "I was busy with an important project. Working late." Daniel folded his hands in his lap. "I got home after midnight and found her still gone. I wanted to call, but I thought she'd gotten caught up in her work again. Sometimes she'd stay in the studio all night." "Where were you between 9 o'clock and 11 p.m.? "In the office. We've got a rush project for a government client, deadlines looming." "Can anyone confirm that?" "Several colleagues saw lights on in my office, and I was on a video conference with the team." Lillian jotted down this information. "Mr. Foster, did you know your wife was HIV positive?" Something flashed in his eyes for a moment. Pain? Anger? "What? No, that can't be true." "We have her medical records and her personal diary. She was diagnosed 3 weeks ago." "I didn't know anything." Daniel shook his head. "Why didn't she tell me?" "Probably the same reason she hadn't told me about her relationship with Ryan Grant." Foster froze, then slowly looked up. "What are you talking about?" "Your wife and Mr. Grant have been in a romantic relationship for the past few months. You didn't know?" "No." He gripped the armrests of his chair. "Yeah, Ryan and I were friends at university. How could she—" "Mr. Foster, are you saying you didn't know about your wife's diagnosis or her affair with your ex-boyfriend?" "That's right." His voice hardened. "And if you're implying that I might have— I loved my wife, Detective. Despite our problems, I would never hurt her." Lillian nodded, noting the man's emotional restraint. Too restrained for a man who had just lost his wife and learned of her infidelity. "We'll check your alibi, Mr. Foster, and I'll need to see the house with your permission." "Of course." He stood up. "What exactly are you looking for?" "At this point, anything that might help us understand what happened." Daniel walked her to the door. "Detective, do you have any suspects? The investigation has only just begun, but rest assured we'll find whoever did this." Already in the car, Lillian wrote down her first impressions. 2 men connected to the victim, both claiming they didn't know about something critical. One emotionally wrecked, the other suspiciously collected. Both have a motive, one has no confirmed alibi. A classic triangle complicated by an HIV diagnosis. New information awaited her at the police station. Blood tests on Ryan Grant's clothes showed it was indeed his own blood. The prints from the crime scene were still being processed. Carol Pierce was not found at Ryan's address. The neighbor said there had been a terrible row in the morning and Carol had left after slamming the door. By mid-afternoon, a red-haired woman burst into the station, clearly hungover but with a determined look on her face. "Where's Detective Meffridge? I'm Carol Pierce." Lillian met her in the interview room. "Miss Pierce, we've been trying to find you." "Miss Pierce, we've been trying to find you. I just heard the news." Carol rubbed her reddened eyes. "God, I can't believe Melissa. And now you suspect Ryan? This is absurd. Mr. Grant claims to have spent the evening with you." "He did." Carol straightened up. "We closed the bar at 8 o'clock, but we stayed. Ryan. He was in a terrible state. After he found out about his diagnosis, he started drinking even more. Last night he just snapped. Broke a glass display case. I tried to calm him down." "What time was that?" Around 9 o'clock, maybe a little earlier. I remember exactly because I called my husband at 9 and lied about doing an inventory. She grimaced. I couldn't say I was getting drunk with Ryan. So what happened next? We sat and talked and drank. I tried to be supportive. At some point, both of us just passed out on the couches in the back. Carol rubbed her temples. I woke up around 7 in the morning and drove home. Ted made a scene, smashed my phone. Anyway, I went to my sister's to sleep it off. It wasn't until recently that I found out what happened. What did you and Mr. Grant talk about? Melissa, of course. About his diagnosis. About what they were going to do now. Carol sighed. He was devastated, Detective, but he wasn't angry with her. There was no aggression in any of his words. He was just broken. Are you close to Mr. Grant? We've been best friends since college. Carol looked at Lillian seriously. I know him better than anyone, and I swear to you, he's not capable of hurting Melissa. He loved her. And what about Daniel Foster? What was their relationship like? Carol snorted. Former friends. Ryan was always there for Daniel, supporting him. And when Ryan's father died a year ago, Daniel didn't even show up for the funeral, said he had an important presentation. After that, Ryan stopped considering him a friend. And started dating his wife soon after? Not right away. Carol shook her head. Melissa first just came to the bar, looking for companionship. Daniel ignored her, always working. They gradually grew closer. Do you think Daniel Foster knew about their relationship? Carol hesitated. I don't know. He's not the type to show emotion, but if he did... She stopped talking. You should check him out, Detective, not Ryan. Lillian nodded, making notes. Thank you for your candor, Miss Pierce. We'll check out all the suspects. The next 2 days were filled with checking alibis, interviewing witnesses, analyzing evidence. Gradually, the story of Melissa Foster and her relationship with both men became clearer, but something still didn't add up. Although Carol's testimony confirmed Ryan's alibi, Lillian still wasn't entirely convinced. Maybe her friend was just trying to protect him. But when fingerprint analysis showed that the blood on the broken window in the bar matched Ryan's fingerprints, and no other traces were found at the crime scene, the story began to look different. On the 3rd day of the investigation, Lillian decided to personally check Daniel Foster's alibi. There was something about his impeccable account of his evening at work that made her uneasy. At Technosystems, she received a wary welcome. A visit from the police is always unsettling. She'd been asked to speak to the head of the department where Foster worked. Daniel is one of our best engineers, said James Collins, the project team leader. He's a hard worker. He was working late that night because we were on a government deadline. Did anyone see him in person? Lillian asked. Not me personally, but his office was locked, the lights were on, and his coworkers could hear him talking to the team via video link. Walking down the hallway to Foster's office, Lillian noticed 2 workers installing something in the wall. Is there a problem with the connection again? A passing employee asked. No, just a routine replacement, one of the workers replied. We don't want a repeat of last week. Lillian slowed her step, listening. What happened? She asked casually. We accidentally drilled into the wall in the wrong place and cut the network cable. The worker shook his head. The whole eastern sector was left without internet until morning. We had to order new cables right away. When exactly did this happen? Last Thursday around 4 in the afternoon, the day of the murder. Lillian made a mental note. And which offices were out of communication? Almost the whole corridor. The worker pointed with his hand. That corner, one over there, that's Mr. Foster's office, and a couple of others nearby. That was an unexpected clue. If Foster claimed he was participating in a video conference from his office, and the internet wasn't working. Lillian found a system administrator who confirmed the incident. Yeah, we have it in our logs. The cable to Foster's office and 2 other neighboring offices was completely severed. The internet was down until the next morning. That's odd, Lillian said thoughtfully. Mr. Foster claims to have participated in the video conference in the evening from his office. Unless he was using a phone or other device with mobile internet, the receptionist shrugged. The wired internet was definitely not working. On the morning of the day, Ramirez knocked on Lillian's office. Detective, I checked Foster's company. The office is indeed undergoing renovations. and the construction workers mentioned some sort of cable problem that day. Interesting. Lillian rose from her chair. I think we should go there again. At Technosystems, Lillian was greeted warily, but after showing her badge, she was escorted to the Human Resources Department. The construction foreman, a man in shabby work clothes, was wiping his hands with a rag when she found him in the hallway. Sorry to bother you. I'm investigating a case involving a company employee, Daniel Foster. I'm told you had a cable failure on the day of the murder? That's right, the foreman nodded. My guys accidentally drilled through a wall and damaged a network cable. These modern offices, all the wiring is in the walls. We informed the IT guys right away. What sector did this happen in? East Wing, where the project manager's offices are. Foster works there in the corner. Lillian made a note. When exactly did it happen? About 4 in the afternoon. We were done by 5, but the IT guys said they wouldn't fix it until the next day. Next stop was the IT department, where the system administrator confirmed the incident. Yeah, it's in our logs. The cable to Foster's office and 2 other neighboring offices was completely severed. The internet was down until the next morning. That's odd, Lillian said thoughtfully. Mr. Foster claims to have participated in the video conference that evening. Unless it was from a phone or other device with mobile internet, the receptionist shrugged. The wired internet was definitely not working. Lillian asked if she could talk to Foster's co-workers, and she was escorted to the developers' offices. Marcus Johnson, one of the colleagues Daniel had mentioned, looked at her in surprise when she asked about the evening call. The evening call? That afternoon? No, there was no evening call. We usually have all meetings before 6. But some of the employees mentioned hearing Daniel talking in his office late at night. Oh, you mean that? Marcus nodded. The door was locked, but the lights were on and Daniel's voice could be heard. We couldn't make out the words, though. We just knew he was there. Do you remember what the conversation was about? No, we weren't listening. Daniel often works late, especially with this government project. Lillian continued her questioning and found out that no one on the team was on the call with Foster that night. A janitor was walking by the office, and Lillian decided to talk to him. I always start cleaning on the east wing, the older man said. Mr. Foster's office was locked that night, but the lights were on. I could hear his voice. He was talking about some technical details of the project. Something about interfaces and processors. Did you hear him well? Quite well. The janitor nodded. It was strange that he had been discussing the same thing for so long. What do you mean? Well, I was cleaning the hallway for about 40 minutes, and the whole time I heard the same phrases. Maybe they were arguing in circles, I don't know. Lillian raised an eyebrow. The same phrases? Are you sure? Yeah, something about algorithms and databases. I wasn't really listening, but it felt like the conversation was repeating itself. It was a lead. Lillian requested the company's security footage and found that Daniel Foster left the building at 6 p.m. through an unguarded emergency exit. A camera in the parking lot recorded his car pulling out at 6:10. At the same time, the lights in his office remained on, and his co-workers could hear his voice until late into the night. With this information, Lillian requested a warrant to listen to the office security recordings. To her surprise, the voice in Foster's office was indeed repeating the same phrases, with slight variations every 15 to 20 minutes. It wasn't a live conversation. It was a recording. The technical expert confirmed. Judging by the nature of the sound and repetition, someone had recorded fragments of the conversation and was playing them back in a circle. And one of the guards remembered that Foster himself had entered the building in the morning with a small box. As it turned out later, it contained a compact Bluetooth speaker with a replay function. All of these details together gave Lillian enough reason to re-interview Daniel Foster. This time his self-confidence was shaken. Mr. Foster, Lillian began as he sat down across from her. We checked out your company. There were repairs being made that evening, and the network cable to your office was damaged around 4 o'clock in the afternoon. The internet was down until the next morning. Daniel paled slightly. I had a laptop. I connected through a cell phone hotspot. Interesting. Your co-workers claimed they didn't see a laptop on your person that day, and no one on the team remembers a video conference that evening. They must be confusing the dates. He shrugged, but less confidently. The security cameras recorded you leaving the building at 6 hours and 10 minutes past 6 in the evening. Lillian placed the photos in front of him. But your colleagues heard your voice in the office until late at night. How do you explain that? Daniel was silent, and Lillian continued. When we searched your house, we found something interesting. Printouts of Melissa's medical tests, photos of her with Ryan Grant, taken apparently during the surveillance. You claimed you didn't know about her diagnosis or the affair, but these documents say otherwise. I can explain, Daniel began, but Lillian interrupted. And the technical expert confirmed that the voice in your office tonight was a recording played back in a loop. The security guard identified you with a Bluetooth speaker that morning. Daniel lowered his head. When he looked at Lillian again, his eyes were cold. You don't understand. She betrayed me. Both of them betrayed me. She slept with my friend and gave me a deadly disease. What was I supposed to do? Not kill her, Lillian answered quietly. I didn't plan it. I just wanted to talk. His voice was shaking. I left the tape. I went to her studio. I thought we could talk about it. But she said she loved him. She said she was going to leave me, that she was sorry, but she didn't care about me after all I'd done for her. He slammed his fist on the table. I don't remember grabbing the knife. I just wanted her to stop talking. The silence in the room became deafening. Lillian nodded slowly. Daniel Foster, you are under arrest for the murder of Melissa Foster. You have the right to remain silent. He sat motionless as she read out his rights. His face was blank like a mask. Only in his eyes the fire of rage that led to the tragedy burned out. Later, filling out the report, Lillian thought about how easily love turns to hate, how thin the line between passion and rage. Melissa Foster had looked for love where she shouldn't have and paid for it with her life. Daniel, who lost everything he thought was his, broke under the weight of betrayal. Ryan is left alone with his diagnosis and guilt. Lillian stopped by the Blue Guitar Bar in the evening, after her shift was over. She had to inform Ryan that the case was closed, that he was no longer a suspect. It was empty inside, just Ryan and Carol sitting at the counter. She was holding his hand, and even without looking at them, Lillian felt the bond between the two of them, not romantic, but perhaps even stronger. It's over, Lillian said as she approached them. Daniel Foster confessed to the murder. Ryan nodded as if he'd been expecting that. He found out about us? And the diagnosis? Yes, he found the prescription and did his own investigation. Carol squeezed his hand tighter. What now? The trial, Lillian shrugged. Given his confession and the evidence, the sentence will be harsh. And us? Ryan asked quietly. What's in store for us? Lillian didn't know what to say. She couldn't promise that everything would be all right, that the diagnosis wouldn't change their lives forever. Life goes on, she finally said, even after it seems like it's over. As Lillian left, she saw Ryan and Carol's reflection in the mirror above the bar. They were sitting shoulder to shoulder, quietly discussing something. Two figures frozen in a world that had changed overnight beyond recognition. Two lives bound together not only by friendship, but also by a common trial. And somewhere behind bars sat Daniel Foster, an engineer who thought he had calculated everything, who had created the perfect alibi but could not cope with his own rage. A man who had lost everything, his wife, his career, his future, over a few minutes of anger that had destroyed 3 lives overnight. Lillian closed the bar door, thinking that sometimes even the worst crimes begin with simple human emotions, love, betrayal, fear, and that the thin line between normal life and tragedy can be crossed by anyone if they let their emotions prevail over reason. The case was closed. The culprit had been found. But the question that plagued Lillian remained unanswered. Could things have turned out differently if only one of the participants in this drama had made a different choice?